Good morning. I was actually hoping Lakshmi will bring some of those James Bond AI gadgets with us today to do some demonstration, but not. Oh, here we go. All right, but I do strongly agree one of the points that Lakshmi made, and I often talk about this during my sort of training and other conference participation as well, is that it takes human intelligence to really make AI work. And this is not a fad of a technology when investigator lawyers and auditors are the one also asking for AI enablement. So, I've testified about this statement a couple times in front of Congress. I think we do truly live in a golden era of renaissance when it comes to how AI is now dominating every facet of our world. If you think about it, if you have Netflix, if you have Spotify, if you have Siri, if you have Alexa, those are all largely sort of AI driven. And whether you knew or not, a lot of your spam filters are AI driven as well in terms of how they can sort of smartly block the kind of communication that may be malicious. But the reality, and I sort of listed here, is for a federal agency, one of the things I will talk about today is that we don't get to say oops. So these bullets I listed are what I call from Temple of Executive Prayers when it comes to AI implementation in the public sector. First and foremost, one of the most common things that I encounter is, I hope my employee is not logging into chatgpt.com or perplexity.com and start uploading non-public sensitive information just because they want the information summarized. That is the worst case scenario nightmare for CIO, CAIO, agency leadership. And then, AI have this sort of an auto-magical sense to it. And so a lot of conversation focus around, if I just implement that AI, it will automatically understand my horrible data. Make sense of it, and let me just shove a bunch of stuff in, and will make a sort of consistent and coherent response. Spoiler alert, that's not true. And then, we often think AI as a sort of a form of technology. One of the reasons I was appointed as both the CAIO and the CDO for Office of Personnel Management was because I do believe AI should be an extension of data, not just as technology, but as a sort of data science or tradecraft, there are very specific enterprise architectural concern, right? Like implementing AI is not the same thing as implementing your ERP system or your Microsoft 365 solutions. And so as a data scientist, how do we sort of enable, for example, different kind of data store? And we'll talk about some of those sort of consideration. How do we think about an AI that is probabilistic? Right, so Excel is very good at telling you black and white, truth or false. It doesn't really change. But with AI, the answer you get on Monday may be slightly different than an answer you get on Thursday. So how do you operate in that environment? And lastly, AI is one of those technologies that you can't just sort of deploy and forget it, right? The performance degrades over time. So how do you sort of continuously monitor the implementation? Procurement is also a challenge. We often talk about the sort of the clunkiness and dysfunction of FAR, Federal Acquisition Regulation. My time at GAO, when we first started sort of crying kind of a cloud infrastructure, we were trying to buy cloud like we were buying widgets. And the contracting officer wanted me to print out the entirety of Amazon Web Services sort of service catalog. It would have been a 15,000 page contract, and I had to negotiate pricing on every single storage and compute. That may sound silly, but AI is the same thing. We can't buy AI like we're buying widgets. How do we make sure that there's sort of data sovereignty? How do we make sure that there are sort of inherent sort of governmental interests that are protected? But also, how do we account for performance that may evolve? And last but not the least, at least up till recently, and I think on the stats over there, there are more than 2,000 use cases across federal agency on the use of AI, which is great, right? Government often is sort of thought of lagging behind adoption of emerging technology. But maybe counterintuitively, I don't think having a bunch of prototypes that have no path forward is actually that useful. So we often talk about the sort of concept of valley of death. How do we scale from a cute prototype to something that can benefit all of your agency or all of the sort of public-facing function that the agency is supporting? And so, how do you actually go from a sort of proof of concept to something that is secure, that's resilient, that's robust? That's a whole different conversation. So I see a lot of CIO and CDO and CIO sort of pray in this temple of executive prayer often to sort of seek best practices, even in the midst of how quickly technology itself is evolving. But let me set the context. This particular session is about the foundations of AI. And more specifically, I'm probably going to focus a little bit more on generative AI. At the simplest level, what generative AI is this particular sentence. Roses are red, violets are, and most people will know the likely word that follows is blue. And at the simplest level, and that's what all generative AI is doing, it's trying to determine what is the word that has the highest probability that should appear, right? Even with that basic concept, you're now able to do summarization, translation, vibe coding. There's a lot of fantastical use cases, and the one that comes to mind is Google's DeepMind, that they were able to really map out 200 million protein structure that up to very recently has taken scientists decades, if not almost a century, to try to do that brute force. So it is fundamentally changing how biopharma research is being done once you understand the protein structure. But AI is not magical, and so I sort of created this sort of example just to illustrate at the simplest level. It's really just trying to predict what the next sort of word should be. But let's step a moment and think about what is AI itself. If you're looking for a governmental definition, I will point you to the fiscal year 2019 National Defense Authorization Act. Don't ask me why Congress decides to shove a definition of AI in an NDAA, but that's what they did. But also notice the date. FY19 is 6 or 7 years old, depending on how you're counting it. In AI years, that might as well be 40 to 50 dog years, right? So it's a sort of a dated concept. But if you read that definition, and this is my personal opinion, it's very philosophical. It's very Shakespearean and poetic even. But as a data scientist reading that FY19 NDAA, I have no idea what AI is supposed to do or not, right? And so I think it starts with how do we define AI as a thing? Here's my take on it. If you sort of take component view of what AI is, usually you start with some sort of algorithm, whether that's machine learning model, deep learning model, large language model for the purpose of this conversation. That distinction is not that important, but you start with some sort of algorithmic model. But models themselves don't do anything. It's like watching paint dry. But you have to have some data to give it the context in which those model needs to operate. So models and data are like peanut butter and jelly. They go hand in hand, and one without the other really don't function that well. But model and data, they can't really directly interact with users. So you need some sort of front-end user interface. And that's why you see ChatGPT, right? That's why you see some of the browser-based interfaces that you can ask prompts. You can sort of using natural language to sort of converse with that model and the underlying data to sort of get some response out of that system. But that user interface also has to be fast and has to be quick, right? If you ask the question and it takes 5 minutes for that response to come back, you likely won't be using it. Now, there's some exception in terms of how agentic AI these days are functioning, but mostly a user interface needs to be interactive, needs to be sort of engaging, and it has to be performing. Now, behind the scene, right, there is no trivial matter when it comes to the kind of IT infrastructural architectural consideration that are specific to AI. This is not the kind of data warehousing effort that you would normally think about, but we're talking about, for example, vector store. We're talking about the kind of compute that maybe requires use of GPU, things like that. And cybersecurity, right? This is different than your sort of maybe traditional infrastructural protection. The way that AI is being used also has a dual purposes. AI could be used to protect your cybersecurity, and AI could be used to perhaps penetrate your cybersecurity guardrails. And then we talked about procurement. The way how we buy things doesn't always correspond to the speed in which technology may be coming online, whether depending on product and services. But last but not the least, we have policy, we have governance, right? AI is sort of talked about in the context of opportunities, but also talked about in the context of consequences. Job displacement, for example, privacy violations, IP violation, things of that nature. So how do we make sure that we have a sort of governance structure in place to sort of safeguard those what I call sort of democratic value that we care about. And then policy. How do you make and traditionally the way that policy is done is you write something down, you publish it, and you sort of move on to the next thing. But given how fast the technology is sort of moving in the AI space, I suspect whatever policy that you have in place right now, it's largely OBE, right? So how do you have an evolving policy that sort of adapts to the posture of the technology? And last but not the least, digital literacy. If you take it at its face value that AI will be transformative, let's make sure our people can use that technology well, make sure that we can sort of actually carry on those inherently governmental function, requirements gathering, performance, value, measure, things like that, that we actually understand how the underlying technology works in a way that we can influence what right should look like versus what wrong should look like. So that's my view of what AI is, if you sort of take a component view of it. And maybe it also takes a bit of a complexity away in a sense that it's not just a data scientist's problem or not an IT professional's problem. Now you have legality issue, you have privacy issue, you have procurement issue, you have human capital issue, where it becomes now a team sport. And as a former CIO, I think one of my sort of core function was making sure that I am sequencing these conversations in a logical way so that we can address all of these technical and functional and policy related consideration in the right moment. One of my biggest pet peeves when we talk about AI, it's like watching that movie Lord of the Rings, that there's like one AI that rules them all. And I think the reality is a little bit more nuanced, all right? So this is, again, my take on it. I think there are 5 flavors of AI, and the risk calibration, the kind of risk management should tailor to each one of these flavors. It starts with maybe like a consumer type of service, like the ChatGPT, Perplexity, Claude of the world. You launch your browser and you sort of go to those services. And I just used it in my recent trip to taking my family to Paris. It was very good at giving me a travel itinerary. Where are the kids-friendly restaurant? And I actually mapped it all. Great. It wasn't perfect, but it was a good start. But that's not necessarily how agencies are engaging with AI, at least not most of the time, right? There may be some use cases where it is appropriate to go to that sort of public, openly available AI services to maybe open source research and sort of some other maybe less sensitive kind of function. But for the most part, we don't necessarily rely on employee using ChatGPT to do their work. As a matter of fact, with every agency that I've been worked at, there's been a very specific prohibitions around that kind of usage. So next category, general purpose, right? So this is where I would maybe cite Microsoft Office 365 Copilot as an example. It's a general purpose AI. It will summarize your inbox. And who wouldn't want their inboxes summarized? It can create PowerPoint on the fly, right? You can, instead of memorizing Excel functions, you can now engage Excel in sort of a natural language to create pivot tables, to create different filters. But Office 365 Copilot doesn't necessarily understand the context of your agency, the mission in which you operate, because it was not trained specifically for your agency's function. Nevertheless, it has its value proposition. The part that, at least that I spend a lot of time on when I was at OPM and GAO, the sort of third category of what I call bespoke solution, something that agency decided to create to support the agency's specific function. At GAO, we had a sort of prototype looking at information retrieval kind of thing to allow auditors to look at any given sort of domain in a sort of horizontal way. At OPM, we were developing a sort of a hiring enablement that made the position description much more consistent. Sidebar, if anybody ever tried to hire a role under 2210, you know how wide 2210 is, and you can drive 3 trucks side by side, and you can sort of compare position description, 10 of them, and they will all look very different. So the idea was using sort of large language model to sort of engage with hiring manager to say what kind of role are you looking to hire, and then be able to go into a previously classified and sort of adjudicated position description to come up with a sort of position description for cybersecurity for AI engineer. And that was something that can potentially improve the hiring experience. But that's a bespoke solution, right? That's not something that is available in the market that specifically understood the nuances of the federal hiring process. And then we have the fourth category of commercial tool. Think Grammarly, think Adobe. These are very function-specific tools. Like Grammarly is not going to create a travel itinerary for me in Paris, but it could tell me how I should be using Oxford comma more, right? And the last category here is probably the one that keeps me up at night the most. I call this sort of hypes and surprises. I will turn on my laptop and all of a sudden in the upper right-hand corner, something flashy to say, try this new AI feature. Whoa. My first email to my CIO is, who turned this on? Did we buy this thing? Did we ask for this thing? Did we actually have sort of risk management sort of protocol around this new thing? Not that we don't necessarily want the feature per se, but it's something that given the hype cycle of AI, every product now has some sort of AI tagline, whether it's true AI or not. But as a sort of technology professionals, we don't like to be surprised, right? So when sort of that kind of surprising AI shows up, now we have to retrospectively deal with a lot of sort of procurement, technology, architectural, cybersecurity issue to say, who let this thing through the firewall? And so those are at least my take on 5 different flavors of sort of AI. And your agency's posture likely will require different calibrations of that. I'm going to go out on a limb to say I doubt most agency will rest their AI objective strictly on ChatGPT.com or some other sort of browser-based system. The one asterisk I'll add is, a couple years ago, prompt engineer was the rage. These days, a new term has propped up. It's called agentic AI. And I specifically put it in the sort of neighborhood of bespoke solution and commercial tool, is that agentic AI sounds cool, but really all it does is it can now automatically execute certain function to you where previously you had to sort of manually sort of carry them out. So I go back to my example of creating a travel itinerary using ChatGPT, right? It gave me an output that was very helpful in terms of which restaurant to go, which sightseeing location, which, a playground that I should take my kids to. But it didn't actually book those reservations, right? It didn't actually coordinate how I might sort of go around my day. Agentic AI can now take that information and actually execute. Whether it's booking airline reservation, whether it's making, hopefully in the future, restaurant reservation, and be able to sort of optimize in terms of, how would you get there through public transit, because in Paris, we didn't have a car. So I think this is where a sort of evolving frontier in terms of how do we take a number of AI, strengthen them together to carry out automatically some of the function. Now, that in light, another risk to say, if we think it's hard to unpack the current crops of AI, trying to figure out how the strings of AI getting sort of connected to sort of auto-execute function, that's another layer of complexities. Let me spend some time on bespoke solution, right? The way that I talk about it is bespoke solution is something that your agency might, use certain LLM and certain sort of workflow integration to develop, whether it's hiring function, whether it is some sort of adjudication function. I actually talked about some of the mission enablement. Certainly in the national defense world, you can sort of think tons and tons of example where you can't really procure that kind of capabilities on the street, and you have to likely build it, integrate it, and somehow deploy it. That's where I see a lot of value for the agency, but also perhaps a lot of risks for the agency, because most of us developing AI solution is probably not the core function of that agency, right? So given the evolving performance and behavior of models, how do you sort of account for that, especially if you didn't develop those models yourself? And a couple of reasons why your agency might be thinking about bespoke solution. The data that you rely on has to be based on non-public information, right? That's one thing. You may not necessarily rely on the Wikipedias, the Reddits, and the YouTubes of the world to come up with some governmental sort of response. The second one is maybe that response needs to be contextually constrained. I'll give an example. New York City rolled out like a digital 311 chatbot kind of thing a couple years ago to ostensibly help citizens answer some of these, Byzantine bureaucracy that is New York City. I don't know what happened, but they didn't really test it, right? So you end up with response like, can I discriminate against Section A voucher holder? Sure, go right ahead. This is the kind of thing that certainly it's a nightmare scenario for a chief AI officer, but this is the kind of thing that you may want to constrain what the output is so that you're not hallucinating and you're not allowing certain kind of prompts. I'll give another example. With a lot of use cases that we were developing in OPM, they're very maybe hiring, maybe human capital specific. We certainly didn't want people, and no joke, we didn't want people to sort of entertain prompts like, how do I detonate a bomb inside an agency? Right? We don't know how people will engage with these technology, but as a matter of caution, we will pre-program that user interface to disallow that type of discussion. So the response has to be constrained in some way. And so I mentioned this is an area likely that will deliver the highest value, but perhaps also a series of unknowns, right? We won't get into technical detail, but some of the terms that you likely will come up against on a bespoke solution. One is called retrieval augmented generation, or short for RAG. That's a very unfortunate acronym. But all RAG means is that you're pointing that model to your agency's trusted data as opposed to the internet. And there are very specific technical concerns around that. You might even hear the word hyperscaler. That is a fancy term for use of cloud services. Because traditionally, the way that data scientists have worked is you may be developing a model on your agency laptop. You might test it and deploy it on your agency laptop. But we can all imagine that is not necessarily a scalable approach. You need to inherit the kind of performance, the kind of security guardrail that a cloud infrastructure offer. So more and more we're seeing development of AI capabilities that sits on top of Microsoft Azure or AWS or Google Cloud. And so the use of hyperscaler is becoming a very integrated part of AI development. And then cloud infrastructure themselves often rely on AI to make sure that they scale on the compute, on storage, et cetera. You might also hear terms like vector data store. So the way that AI models access information, it's not tapping into your data warehouse and just kind of vacuum everything up. You have to very specifically convert that data into a series of directions. So remember that sentence says roses are red, violets are blue. One of the reasons that AI models knows that the most likely word is that is the shortest distance to that possible word. So you now need to convert your traditional corpus of data into something called vector data store. It's fairly straightforward, but perhaps a new concept. And I mentioned it's not Lord of the Rings, so there are thousands and thousands and thousands of large language models out there. You can sort of log into Hugging Face and just take a look at all of the available models. Some do different things very well. Some don't do certain things well. And so you have sort of this concept of model selection. How do you know this model is the right one for you, as opposed to defaulting to maybe the one with the biggest name recognition, like OpenAI or Llama or Claude. And even within those big players, there are different flavors, right? We often talk about LLM as large language model. But maybe for what you need to do, you don't really need LLM. You need a medium language model or a small language model, something that doesn't have the complexity of 80 billion parameters trying to churn all the time, that incur cost, that incurs compute. There certainly are environmental impacts to how these data centers are run. So thinking about the right model selection is, I think, an important consideration, and it's a trade-off discussion between performance and accuracy. And last but not the least, there's nothing magical about just shoving a bunch of data into LLM and expect good answers. This is where foundational concept like metadata management and taxonomy becomes very important, because how you might describe budgetary obligation for your agency may be entirely different from another agency. So how do you standardize some of that sort of description of the data itself to give additional context to your AI-enabled solution. So these are the kind of things beyond maybe some of the infrastructural issue that sort of bespoke solution come across. And I'm happy to talk more about in each of these concepts. But as you can see, now we're getting into a territory that is sort of slight departure from your traditional IT functions. I'm a big believer of this. Public sector entity don't get to say oops when it comes to AI deployment. But I do also think it is the public sector that is driving the conversation around accountability coexisting with innovations, right? When I was at GAO, I often had to sit side by side with my Chinese counterpart and my Russian counterpart, where those guardrails may not necessarily exist in the same way. But how do we then talk with our allies to say accountability is not a hindrance to innovation? It's not exclusive or kind of relationship. But the trick is, how do we develop the agile kind of governance, again, moving at the speed of technology, right? I think most agency, you may be familiar with a sort of risk management construct that you meet once a month, maybe once a quarter, for an hour with senior agency leadership to try to talk about everything that is sort of risky, AI or not AI. And no surprisingly, you get nothing done, right? For an hour, you can't possibly drill deeply enough into some of these really nuanced risk considerations. So how do you develop that agile governance in a way that maybe meet more frequently? At OPM, we had a sort of 2 pizza rule. We invite a bunch of folks that were empowered to make what I call micro decisions along the way with perhaps imperfect data. And I would, as a CIO, elevate those higher risk functions to the agency senior leadership level for adjudication. But we didn't try to cram all of the AI stuff into that 60-minute agenda, of which I make it 10 minutes to talk about different use cases. So public sector AI implementation is hard. First of all, we care about democratic value, right? We care about civil liberty. And AI or no AI, we often talk about regulations of AI, but there's still Privacy Act that we have to adhere to. There's still Civil Rights Act we have to adhere to. There are a bunch of sort of statutory regulations that, even though AI is really nice, it doesn't change the fundamental that compliance requirements. And so again, I think this is where agile governance comes into play to say, how do we adapt those traditional mindset to support the risk management function of AI implementation within public sector? I'm using emoji to summarize data quality because that's the only way I know how to describe it, right? Most agency have sort of data interoperability issue that is at best, shrug. I even seen instances when I was at GAO, when we were requesting information, we still have agency that will provide to us PDF scan of Excel spreadsheet as a form of data. Right. So, of course, naturally, we will use cloud AI solution to unpack that, but that's a different conversation. There's often talk about, data needs to sort of break across silo. Well, that's easier said than done, right? So how do we make sure that data is not only accessible, but interoperable? So there are emerging standards out there that unless we solve the sort of AI challenges, we're just going to end up using AI to maybe accelerate those silos. And so I think that's another sort of key consideration is not just treating AI as an extension of technology, but really as an extension of data. The next one is, I think we're all familiar with this. Many agencies are built on series of analog process that we're trying to govern digital solutions with. And I'm a big fan of saying, like, if you want to implement AI in a very strategic way, then you also need to open up the ability to reimagine what those processes should have been, right? And then most agencies are not really built to do that. So how do you then look backwards to say, should we always have that kind of procedure or assessment or risk management structure now that we have sort of certain AI enablement? And so I think trying to use 20th century analog sort of set of tools to govern, to implement a 21st century technology doesn't necessarily make sense. And I've already talked about the procurement issue. Like we can't buy AIs like we're buying widgets. Let me just quickly summarize, I'm short on time here. OMB issued a memo early in this year. And some of us who were sort of anticipating this certainly had a level of anxiety because we weren't sure where the administration was taking given the rescission of EO 14110. But my personal opinion here, I actually think the OMB memo is very logical. So first of all, it codifies the role of chief AI officer. And I think that is perhaps somewhat of innovation within the public sector. If you talk about with most commercial entity, they're using the chief compliance officer to drive some of these AI governance issues. But I think chief AI officer is important role because you need to have someone who can coordinate and sequence these set of conversation in the right way. And more specifically, and this is my last box here, the OMB memo says you must now carry out public hearing to solicit feedback from people that are impacted by the decisions of AI. I don't really recall a form of technology that had that requirement before. Did you have to get public hearing from invention of laptops or even cloud computing? Probably not. And so, this is chief AI officer is taking that team sports mentality to make sure that we're tackling this issue sort of collectively with sort of multidisciplinary perspective. It combines the previously safety impacting and rights impacting category into one high impact. I think that's a logical thing, right? Because I was spending a lot of time trying to parsing the nuance between what is safety impacting, what is rights impacting, and what are some of the things that overlap. So I think that's a logical extension. Continue the requirements of AI inventory. I interact with the OMB a lot. Last year there were some clunkiness in terms of how the previous OMB guidance was being issued, but I think it's a good thing for agency to continue to submit where they are in the AI journey. Are we still at the prototyping phase? Are we in the scaling phase? Are we actually deploying AI in a way that is driving value? Now that we're coming out of the sort of hype cycle of AI, you'll see a lot of focus around value. What are we trying to do this? Are we actually gaining the productivity that we're hoping that we're gaining? Are we getting the kind of admission support benefits that we think we're getting? Or are we just incurring a bunch of token costs that's not going anywhere? Another requirement of the OMB memo is sharing of your AI artifacts, the models, the code, et cetera. One of my biggest gripe when I was both at GAO and OPM was when we talk about innovation, what we really mean is I'm going to do my own thing and you're going to do your own thing, right? And the two of us, we're not going to talk because God forbid we share dirty laundry. And so if you go back to my OPM example, hiring function, I get it. Every agency had their nuances, but they're largely the same, right? You have position description, you post a job at usajobs.gov, and you go through the sort of certification process. So why isn't that OPM can't open source our AI solution, put it in GitHub and other agencies might be able to adopt? There's no technical barrier. It's all institutional, cultural, and policy barrier. But the OMB memo specifically, I would say strongly encourage agency to start thinking in that sort of sharing environment, and GSA has a very set of requirements to make that happen. It mandates assessments of AI maturity and AI strategy. I think that makes sense. Without getting sort of sucked into the hype of AI, how do you know what kind of AI makes sense for your agency and whether your agency is ready for it, right? If your agency doesn't have the level of digital literacy or the infrastructure or the policy in place, implementing AI may actually cause more harm than good. And I've already mentioned the public consultation. Parting thoughts, right? These are some of my sort of perspective as a sort of former CIO and CDO implementing AI. First of all, focus on the question. What are we trying to solve? And does that problem require AI? I would say 9 out of 10 times, you may actually have an alternative solution that don't require the complexities of AI. It's all about data. And I know controversially, I say AI is not biased. When we talk about bias, we usually refer to the underlying data in which we use to train or calibrate that performance. There's some sort of skew. So focus on the AI, but not necessarily on the model functioning. Make sure, I've already mentioned this a couple times, making sure governance move at the speed of innovation. They can coexist as long as you put the right framework and structure around it. Treating AI as a team sports and training your people well to use AI And I don't mean these, YouTube videos or even sort of instructor-led training courses. A lot of them are focused on general topic. What is an LLM? Either conversations like this, we're generally talking about AI. Where I see the gap is training on agency-specific implementation of that particular solution that has policy implications around it. So this is where that sort of last mile delivery when it comes to meeting the users where they are relative to what they need to be trained on. Number 6, change management. And this was very true when I was at GAO. Everyone wants innovation, nobody wants change. That doesn't quite work, right? I don't necessarily believe AI should be implemented just to automate the existing analog processes. There's certainly place and time for that, but I do think AI should be used to try to reimagine what those processes should have been. If AI is a digital tool, then you should have a digital-first strategy, not trying to automate the analog processes. The next one is also very controversial for me. A lot of CIOs chagrin when I mentioned this. Analytics is not IT, IT is not analytics, right? And so this comes in the form of sort of budget requests and resourcing requests. At the sort of enterprise IT level, you have these massive ERP systems that just have to be renewed, has to be implemented. And here, whining little data scientist is asking for GPUs, is asking for exotic sort of database structure that don't necessarily conform with existing tech stack. And so that conversation is oftentimes very frictional. And I don't necessarily subscribe to like having one infrastructure that sort of do both enterprise IT and some of the IT AI development work sort of in an equal way. At GAO, I was fortunate enough that we were able to develop the cloud infrastructure that is explicitly designed to support AI development. We didn't host timekeeping system, we didn't host enterprise productivity suite, but it was a specific corner of the cloud infrastructure that we had to experiment, prototype, and iterate. And last but not the least, the concept of continuous monitoring has been talked about before. Be ready to scale your prototype. Think about scalability before you embark on that prototyping phase, but also be prepared to evolve everything, whether that's your architecture, whether that's your policy. Have the framework to revisit those concepts. I mentioned the AI definition before. One of the definitions that I actually like is the OECD definition of AI. Not that I think it's perfect, but since 2019, they have revised that definition 3 times to keep up with advancing sort of technology. And so I think that's an example where as AI is moving, our thought and process needs to move as well. And I am 5 minutes over. Thank you.